Hey guys, this is the first in an additional 2 tests that I'm planning to do for the ongoing discussion on whether aluminum oxide and silicon carbide abrasives can be used on high hardness, high vanadium content steels, or whether there are negative side effects from doing so. After the last series of videos I posted, it was suggested that bamboo chopsticks would form a better test media than the pine I was using previously, and some questions were raised on whether or not I was push cutting straight down or making a draw when doing the push cuts that I was demonstrating in the previous videos. On the later count, I think that if you go back and look at the videos, amongst the many hundreds of test cuts, you can see that many of them are straight down, but nonetheless, I will attempt to highlight this fact more so in these 2 videos. The test knife I'm using for this is the same as I've been using for the rest of this series. It is a Spyderco Mule Team in Maxamet at approximately 68 Rockwell. The edge bevel is at around 15 degrees done freehand. And in this case, the previous apex was cut off, and an Atoma 1200 was used to reduce any light reflecting from the edge bevel from a directed light source until no longer was any light reflecting from the edge bevel from a directed light source. And then I moved on to using a DMT extra fine and a DMT extra fine, which I've got here is what I'm about to use on this, and then I'm going to start the test. Now, for the sake of brevity, I intend to cut out the portion showing myself sharpening this knife, and maybe I'll leave in deburring it, but okay. So now I'm going to mark off a section of the blade we're going to use for this test, because chopsticks are not nearly as large as big pine sticks like I was using, so I'm going to try and make sure that I mark off part of the blade to use for this test, and that should make it easier for you to see that I am not making a draw when I do my cut tests. Alright, so let me just get this out of the way and we can get started with using bamboo as a test media. Now, I showed this during the sharpening, but nonetheless, it's a little trickier to line up trying to turn it so that the camera can see it easier, but I think that serves as a demonstration that the push cutting sharpness is as desired, and that I don't actually make very much of a draw at all when I do push cut tests. Alright, so I'm going to do both the types of cuts that were described to me in the thread where this discussion is ongoing on blade forms on the maintenance, tinkering, and embellishment section on how to do this type of cut test on pine. On bamboo, I mean. The first is to simply cut off the end of the chopstick in this manner. And then the second is to slide the knife in and then twist it up out of the cut, like so. This is apparently supposed to be very hard on an apex. So hard, actually, that you should never, ever, under normal circumstances, deliberately twist out of cuts when whittling. It's not good for your knife. And if your knife is too thin, you can do serious damage to a knife by twisting out of cuts into wood. But for the purposes of putting as much stress on the apex as possible in a short amount of time, it can be an effective test, I guess. But again, I will note that in the real world, you should not be doing this kind of a thing. Okay. Now again, trying to hold this relative to the camera. I think we actually may have a little bit of apex damage, but I'm not sure here. Yep. It's still working pretty well. It's still push cutting along most of this section, but there appears to potentially be a little bit of damage up there. So we'll continue with a bit more. That's not really too useful anymore, but and we'll do a few more hard cuts like this, like I was doing with the pine in the Spyderco medium test. Okay. Maybe if I tilt the knife a little bit more, because some of this is certainly going to be technique, because this is kind of an awkward way to do this. So we'll give the benefit of the doubt here to the DMT extra fine, because I wouldn't expect it to be that much loss of push cutting sharpness that fast. Doesn't seem right to me, but it's possible. I have to say, this seems to be a much more strenuous test than pine actually is. So I have to agree that was a correct suggestion, that this is actually much more difficult on a knife edge. So we're still getting some push cutting, but we're getting quite a bit of tearing at this point already, which is quite surprising, actually. I never realized that bamboo chopsticks could be such a strenuous test of a knife edge. Now, granted, the DMT extra fine passed on pine with flying colors, so that's a pretty good indicator that this must be a much more difficult test, considering that the DMT extra fine had no problem at all with the pine, basically just laughed it off. So I think at this point we can say that there is a noticeable loss of initial push cutting sharpness, and I'm going to take some microscope images of this apex, or rather the edge bevel, because I don't have enough magnification to really actually see the apex directly. That would require an electron microscope, and I'm not that crazy just yet. But I am going to take some USB microscope images to see if there's any visible microchips in this, and I will cut them into the video at this point if there are any. As you'll be able to see from the microscope images I've included, the damage to the edge bevel, or sorry, the damage to the apex microscopically is pretty severe. There's microchips throughout the test area, and so you can see that that explains why there was such a noticeable loss in push cutting sharpness from one chopstick. Did that much damage to the apex. So that's a pretty good explanation or demonstration of why you shouldn't twist out of cuts when whittling, by the way. Mind you, you probably could get away with it with a steel that wasn't this hard or had this high carbide volume, but nonetheless, best practice is to not twist out of cuts when whittling, or at least not that hard. So, but nonetheless, that was a quick demonstration. I wish I'd done this to begin with. It would have been much faster to make videos doing it this way. Although the downside is I'm now going to have to use something fairly coarse to start sharpening out those microchips to do the next round of this test on the Spyderco medium.